The sky above Midway burned with fire as Elias Carter fought to control his crippled fighter plane. Smoke choked the cockpit, blood trickled down his temple, and the deafening roar of explosions filled his ears. His hands gripped the stick with desperate strength as flames licked the wings. Time slowed. Every second, stretching as the aircraft spiraled downward. They told me I didn't belong here, but I never flew to please anyone. 6 months earlier, the world had been different. Pearl Harbor Naval Base stretched beneath the Hawaiian sun like a small city of steel and concrete, where 10,000 men worked and lived in the rigid hierarchy of military life. Among them walked Elias Carter, though he might as well have been invisible. At 6 feet, even with shoulders broadened by years of manual labor before the war, he cut an imposing figure in his pressed uniform. His skin, darkened by both heritage and the relentless Pacific sun, seemed to mark him as clearly as any sign could have. His face carried the angular strength of his grandfather's Cherokee blood mixed with his father's African features. A square jaw that rarely relaxed, deep brown eyes that observed everything while revealing nothing, and the close-cropped military haircut that couldn't quite tame the tight curls at his temples. When he did speak, which wasn't often, his voice carried the low, slightly hoarse quality of someone who'd learned early that being heard and being listened to were two very different things. He'd earned his wings through a subsidiary program of the Tuskegee experiment, one of the few black men allowed to fly for the United States military, though allowed was a generous term. While his white counterparts soared through combat training and patrol missions, Elias found himself assigned to supply runs, mechanical duty, and weather reconnaissance, anything that kept him far from the real action. The other pilots made no secret of their feelings. They'd cross to the other side of the briefing room when he entered, would suddenly fall silent when he approached their conversations, and more than once, he'd found his flight gear mysteriously damaged or missing before scheduled flights. The America of 1941 was fighting a war on multiple fronts, and not all of them were across the ocean. In the military, a man's skin color determined his opportunities more surely than his skill ever could. The Navy had only recently begun accepting black sailors for roles beyond cooking and cleaning, and the idea of a black pilot was so radical that most commanding officers treated it as either a joke or a threat to good order. But war has a way of changing calculations. As casualties mounted and the need for skilled pilots became desperate, even the most entrenched prejudices began to crack, though never enough to crumble entirely. In this world of rigid segregation and barely contained hostility, Elias found exactly one person who treated him as human. Serena Hopkins worked in the base hospital as a Navy nurse, her presence there almost as unusual as his own. Women in military service faced their own battles for respect, though nothing compared to what Elias endured daily. She stood barely 5 feet 4 inches with auburn hair that she kept pinned severely back according to regulations, though a few strands always seemed to escape by midday. Her green eyes carried a warmth that years of seeing broken bodies hadn't managed to extinguish, and when she smiled, which was rarely in those dark days after Pearl Harbor, it transformed her serious face into something almost luminous. Their first meeting had been purely professional, Elias reporting for a mandatory medical check, Serena taking his vitals with the same efficient care she showed everyone. But she'd done something none of the other medical staff had. She'd looked him in the eye and asked about his flying experience, genuinely interested in his answers. It was such a small gesture, yet in a world where he was either invisible or too visible, being seen as simply a pilot, a person, felt like coming up for air after too long underwater. Then there was Archibald Flynn, though everyone called him Archie, the golden boy of Squadron 42. At 31, he was considered old for a fighter pilot, but his 5 years of experience and natural talent made him untouchable. Tall and lean with the kind of sharp features that belonged on recruiting posters, Archie represented everything the Navy wanted the world to see: brave, skilled, unquestionably American in the way that only third-generation Boston Irish could claim. His contempt for Elias went beyond the casual racism of the others. It was personal, visceral, as if Elias's very presence in a flight suit was an insult to everything Archie had worked to achieve. December 7th had changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Elias had been reviewing weather charts in a supply closet that served as his unofficial office when the first bombs fell. The sound was wrong. Not the distant thunder of practice runs, but something immediate, violent, world-ending. He'd run outside to see the impossible. Japanese planes diving through the morning sky. The Arizona exploding in a pillar of fire and smoke that would burn for days. Men screaming and running and dying all around him, while other pilots scrambled for their planes, many of which were already burning. Elias had made a different choice. The base hospital was only 300 yards away, and he could see the wounded already streaming toward it, some carried, some crawling. Without thinking, he'd run toward the chaos rather than away from it. For the next 6 hours, he'd carried stretchers, applied tourniquets with shaking hands, held pressure on wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding. When a Zero strafed the hospital grounds, Elias had thrown himself over a wounded commander, taking shrapnel in his shoulder that he wouldn't notice until hours later, when Serena found him collapsed against a supply cabinet, his uniform soaked with blood, both his own and that of the dozens of men he'd helped save. Commander William Halsey himself had visited Elias in the hospital 2 days later. The gruff admiral had stood at the foot of his bed, eyes unreadable beneath bushy eyebrows, and delivered news that should have been good. For his actions during the attack, Elias was being transferred to active combat duty, assigned to Squadron 42 flying Corsairs. But there was a catch. There was always a catch. It would be provisional, experimental. Any failure, any sign that he couldn't perform to the highest standards, and he'd be back to flying supply runs faster than he could say. Court-martial. The other pilots had received the news of his assignment with a mixture of disbelief and disgust. Archie had been the most vocal, cornering Elias on his first day with the squadron. His breath had smelled of cigarettes and coffee as he'd leaned in close, voice low enough that only Elias could hear. This is a fighting squadron, not some social experiment. You're going to get someone killed. Probably yourself if we're lucky. And I'll be damned if I let you take good men down with you. The words had been carefully chosen. Nothing overtly racial that could be reported, but the message was crystal clear. Training with Squadron 42 was designed to break him, Elias realized quickly. While other pilots flew standard formations and practiced tested maneuvers, Elias found himself assigned the most dangerous positions, the oldest equipment, the most impossible scenarios. During formation practice, his wingmen would mysteriously drift away, leaving him exposed. During mock dogfights, he'd face 3-on-1 odds while the instructors looked the other way. His Corsair would develop mysterious mechanical problems that mechanics couldn't seem to find until after he'd missed crucial training sessions. But Elias had grown up hard in Alabama before the war, had learned to fly on crop dusters held together with wire and prayer, had faced down worse than military hazing. Every slight, every sabotage, every whispered slur just made him fly harder, shoot straighter, push himself beyond what anyone thought possible. In the air, prejudice couldn't follow. Up there, physics didn't care about skin color, only skill, reflexes, and the cold determination to survive. Serena watched it all from the periphery, their interactions limited to brief encounters that shouldn't have meant anything but somehow did. She'd find excuses to be near the airfield during his flights, would leave sandwiches in his locker when she knew he'd been flying too long to eat, would treat his various injuries, the mysterious bruises, the cuts from sabotaged equipment, without asking questions they both knew the answers to. Their conversations were careful, professional on the surface. But underneath ran a current of something neither could afford to acknowledge. 3 weeks into his provisional assignment, Elias flew his first real patrol. The mission was supposed to be routine, reconnaissance over the eastern sectors. watching for any Japanese submarine activity. His wingman was supposed to be Lieutenant Morrison, but at the last minute, Archie had volunteered to take his place. Elias knew it wasn't out of solidarity. Archie wanted to watch him fail personally, to be there when Elias proved everyone right about why black men shouldn't fly combat aircraft. They were 40 miles out when Elias spotted them, shadows beneath the water that didn't match the coral patterns he'd memorized. His hands moved to the radio before he remembered Archie's warning about false alarms, about how trigger-happy colored boys would see enemies everywhere. But those shadows were moving against the current, maintaining formation in a way that no sea life would. He keyed his radio, voice steady despite his racing heart, and called in the contact. Archie's response was predictable. "Negative, Carter. That's just reef shadow. Maintain course." But Elias had already begun his diving turn, camera ready to capture what his eyes already knew. The photographs would later show 3 Japanese submarines in perfect formation, less than 50 miles from Pearl Harbor, close enough for another surprise attack if they hadn't been spotted. The debriefing should have been his vindication. The intelligence officers confirmed the submarine sightings, credited the early warning with potentially saving hundreds of lives. But in the official report, it was Archie's name as flight leader that got the primary credit. Elias was mentioned only in passing, a supporting role in his own discovery. That night, he'd found Serena waiting outside the barracks, her eyes blazing with a fury he'd never seen before. She'd heard about the report, about how they'd stolen even this from him. They stood in the darkness between buildings, and for a moment, her hand touched his, just a brush of fingers. But it was the first time she'd touched him outside of medical necessity. "It's not right," she'd whispered, voice thick with anger and something else. "Nothing about this is right," he'd replied. "But I didn't come here for justice. I came here to fly." The next morning brought catastrophe of a different kind. During a training exercise, Archie's plane suffered a genuine mechanical failure. The irony not lost on anyone. His engine caught fire at 2,000 feet, forcing him to ditch in heavy seas. Without hesitation, Elias had broken formation, diving toward the water despite radio commands to maintain altitude and let the rescue boats handle it. The seas were too rough, the boats too far away. By the time they arrived, Archie would have drowned. Elias had managed something that shouldn't have been possible. A controlled water landing in 5-foot swells next to Archie's sinking Corsair. He'd pulled the unconscious pilot from his flooding cockpit, keeping both their heads above water for 20 minutes until rescue arrived. The salt water had torn at the shrapnel wounds in his shoulder that had never properly healed, and hypothermia had set in by the time the rescue boat pulled them aboard. But both men survived. Archie had woken up in the hospital with Elias sitting in the chair beside his bed, still in his wet flight suit, refusing medical attention until he knew Archie would survive. They'd stared at each other for a long moment, years of hatred and assumptions hanging between them. Then Archie had done something no one expected. He'd extended his hand. The handshake was brief, awkward, but it marked a shift that would ripple through the entire squadron. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic changed subtly but significantly. Archie never became friendly. That would have been too much to expect. But the active sabotage stopped. When other pilots muttered about Elias, Archie's silence spoke volumes. He even began including Elias in tactical discussions, grudgingly acknowledging when his input had merit. It wasn't acceptance, not really, but it was something. Then came the intelligence that would change everything. Coast watchers and codebreakers had pieced together evidence of a massive Japanese fleet movement toward Midway Island. If Midway fell, Hawaii would be exposed. The entire Pacific strategy would crumble. Every available pilot would be needed. Every plane that could fly would be in the air. The question of whether Elias belonged in a cockpit became suddenly, brutally academic. They needed him. The night before they deployed to Midway, Serena had found him preparing his gear in the empty hangar. The huge space echoed with their footsteps as she approached. Carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper, they stood closer than they should have, close enough that he could smell the soap she used, see the worry she tried to hide behind professional composure. "I have something for you," she'd said, pressing the package into his hands. Her father's compass, she explained, carried through the First World War and back. "It always points home," she'd added, and something in the way she said home made his chest tight. He'd wanted to say something meaningful, something that captured what her small kindnesses had meant in this place that tried so hard to break him. Instead, all he managed was, "If I don't come back, tell my mother I got to fly free. You'll come back." She'd replied with a certainty that seemed more prayer than prediction. Then, breaking every rule they'd both been so careful to follow, she'd raised up on her toes and kissed his cheek, her lips barely brushing his skin before she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the hangar with the compass heavy in his hand and the ghost of her touch burning on his face. The Marine pilots stationed at Midway were young, terrified, and hopelessly outnumbered. When Squadron 42 arrived as reinforcements, Elias could see the relief in their eyes, then the confusion when they noticed him. But there was no time for the usual dance of prejudice and proof. Japanese scout planes had been spotted. The attack would come with dawn. In the pre-flight briefing, something unprecedented happened. Archie stood up and announced that Elias would lead the second flight element. The room erupted in surprised murmurs, but Archie's voice cut through them sharp as a blade. "Carter has the best eyes in the squadron and the coolest head under pressure. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me after we've won this thing. If we lose, it won't matter anyway." June 4th dawned blood red on the horizon, and with it came the largest aerial battle of the Pacific War. The Japanese came in waves, Zeros providing cover for Vals and Kates, loaded with bombs and torpedoes, meant to turn Midway into another Pearl Harbor. Elias led his element up to meet them, the Corsair's engine roaring as they climbed through 15,000 feet, 20,000, until the ocean below looked like hammered steel in the morning light. The first Zero came at him head-on, guns blazing. Elias held his fire, held his nerve, waited until he could see the pilot's face before squeezing the trigger. The Corsair's 650 caliber guns tore the Zero apart, sending it spinning toward the ocean in flames. There was no time to think about it being his first kill. 3 more Zeros were already diving on his position. What followed was 20 minutes of controlled chaos that would be studied in war colleges for decades. Elias and his flight wove through the enemy formation like surgeons with scalpels, precise and deadly. His radio calls were calm, professional, directing his pilots with an authority that surprised everyone, including himself. When Morrison's guns jammed, Elias covered him. When Rodriguez took shrapnel and started losing altitude, Elias guided him to safety before returning to the fight. But the real moment came when they spotted the Japanese carriers, 4 floating cities of steel and death, their decks lined with planes preparing for another strike. This was the target that could change everything. Archie's voice crackled over the radio, unusually formal. "Carter, you've got the best angle. Take your element in. We'll cover you." The dive toward the Akagi was the longest 90 seconds of Elias's life. Anti-aircraft fire filled the air so thick it looked solid, like flying through a deadly thunderstorm where every raindrop could kill. His Corsair bucked and shuddered as shrapnel tore through the wings, the fuselage, pieces of his plane falling away like confetti. At 2,000 feet, he released his bombs, pulling up so hard his vision went gray at the edges. Behind him, explosions walked across the Akagi's deck, setting off secondary explosions as armed planes caught fire. That's when the Zero caught him. The Japanese pilot was good, maybe the best Elias had faced. He put rounds through Elias's engine, oil spraying across the windscreen, turning everything black. The engine coughed, died, came back, died again. Elias was losing altitude fast, the ocean rushing up to meet him. His radio was dead, his controls sluggish. This was how it would end. Not in some Alabama field or a segregated barracks, but in the cockpit of a corsair over the Pacific, having proven everything he'd come here to prove. But Elias Carter hadn't survived everything to die now. Fighting controls that barely responded, he managed to level out just above the wavetops, riding ground effect toward the American fleet still over the horizon. The Zero followed, guns chattering, certain of the kill. That's when Archie appeared, diving out of the sun like an avenging angel, his guns turning the Zero into scrap metal before it could fire another round. "Get that bird home, Carter." Archie's voice crackled through static. "That's an order." The landing on the Enterprise should have been impossible. Elias's landing gear wouldn't deploy. His flaps were shot away, and he was flying on fumes and prayer. The deck crew was already preparing the crash barriers when he somehow set the dying corsair down on its belly, sparks flying as metal scraped across steel, stopping just short of the deck edge. When they pulled him from the cockpit, his flight suit was soaked with blood from a dozen wounds he hadn't even noticed, his hands still gripping the stick so tight they had to pry his fingers loose. He woke up 3 days later, in the Enterprise's sick bay, with Serena sitting beside his bed. She wasn't supposed to be there, had pulled every string and called in every favor to get transferred to the carrier when she'd heard his plane went down. Her eyes were red with exhaustion and something else, and when she saw him awake, she did something that would have gotten them both court-martialed if anyone had been paying attention. She took his hand in both of hers and held on like she was keeping him anchored to the world. "The battle's over," she whispered. "We won. You won. The Akagi is at the bottom of the ocean, along with 3 other carriers. The Japanese are retreating. But more than that," she explained. His actions had been impossible to ignore or minimize. Admiral Nimitz himself had reviewed the flight records, had interviewed the pilots. The Navy was being forced to confront what they'd tried so hard to deny, that courage and skill had nothing to do with the color of a man's skin. Elias was being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the first black pilot in the Pacific Theater to receive it. Archie visited the next day, looking uncomfortable in the cramped sick bay. He didn't say much. Archie never did when emotions were involved. But he left a folded piece of paper on Elias's bedside table. It was his own after-action report, written in stark military language that somehow still conveyed something deeper. Lieutenant Carter demonstrated exceptional airmanship and leadership under extreme combat conditions. His actions directly contributed to the sinking of the Japanese carrier Akagi and saved multiple American pilots. I recommend him for immediate promotion and permanent assignment as flight leader. It is my professional opinion that Lieutenant Carter represents the finest qualities of American naval aviation. Recovery took weeks. The shrapnel wounds healed slowly, complicated by infection and the accumulated damage of months of flying with injuries that had never been properly treated. Serena was there through it all, changing his bandages with hands that lingered longer than medical necessity required, reading to him when the pain kept him awake, sitting in comfortable silence when words weren't needed. They never spoke about what was growing between them. The Navy had regulations about fraternization, and society had even stronger ones about the rest. But it was there in every shared glance, every careful touch, every moment they stole in the quiet hours when the rest of the ship slept. One evening, as the sun set through the porthole painting everything gold, Elias finally said what they'd both been thinking. "This thing between us, it's impossible, you know that, right? After the war, in the real world, it can't happen." Serena was quiet for a long moment, then moved her chair closer to his bed, close enough that their knees touched. "My father used to say that impossible was just another word for haven't tried hard enough yet. Besides, you've been doing impossible things since you got here. Why stop now?" The ceremony for his Distinguished Flying Cross was held on the Enterprise's deck with the entire squadron in attendance. Admiral Nimitz himself pinned the medal to Elias's uniform, his weathered face revealing nothing of what it cost the Navy brass to make this admission. But when he shook Elias's hand, his grip was firm, and his nod carried respect that transcended protocol. Archie stood in the front row of the assembled pilots, his face carefully neutral. But when the ceremony ended, he was the first to approach, extending his hand again, this time in full view of everyone. The handshake lasted longer this time, and Archie leaned in close enough to speak without being overheard. "You've earned this and more, Carter. Don't let anyone tell you different." Then, louder, for the benefit of the watching crowd, "Welcome to the Squadron." Properly. This time, the war would continue for 3 more years. Elias would fly dozens more missions, downing 17 enemy aircraft and earning the nickname Shadow for his ability to appear out of nowhere when his fellow pilots needed help. He'd lose friends, including Morrison, who went down over Guadalcanal, and Rodriguez, who didn't come back from a raid on Truk. He'd see the Navy slowly, grudgingly, begin to change. More black pilots arriving, facing the same battles he'd fought but finding the path slightly less impossible because he'd walked it first. Through it all, Serena was there. Officially, she was just a nurse who happened to be stationed at the same bases, on the same ships. Unofficially, she was the reason he kept fighting, kept flying, kept believing that the world they were fighting for might actually be better than the one they'd left behind. They were careful. Always careful. But in stolen moments between battles and duties, they built something that shouldn't have existed, but did anyway. The letter from his mother arrived 2 weeks after Midway, forwarded through military mail that took forever to find pilots who never stayed in one place long. Her handwriting was careful, the letters formed by hands more comfortable with washtubs than pens. But the words carried a weight that made his throat tight. "I heard what you did from Mrs. Washington, whose boy serves on one of them big ships. She says you're a hero now, that you saved lives and sunk ships and made them see what I always knew. That you were meant to fly. But son, you remember what I told you when you left. You don't fly just for yourself. You fly for all of us who never got the chance. For your brother who died in that field. For your father who died in that mine. For every colored child who looks up at them planes and thinks maybe someday. You carry us all up there with you. Don't forget that weight. But don't let it drag you down neither. Let it lift you higher." VJ Day came on a humid August evening in 1945. Elias was standing on the deck of the carrier Yorktown, watching the sun set over Tokyo Bay, where the surrender would be signed the next day. The war was over. They'd won. He'd survived. But more than that, he'd helped reshape what was possible. The Navy had quietly integrated several fighter squadrons, and while there were still battles to fight, walls to break down, the crack in the foundation had become too wide to patch over. Serena found him there as the stars came out, standing close enough that their shoulders touched. They didn't need to speak. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. A society that wasn't ready for them. Families that wouldn't understand. A world that wanted to go back to the way things were before the war changed everything. But tonight, in this moment suspended between war and peace, between impossible and inevitable, they had each other. 6 months later, Elias stood on a pier in San Francisco, watching the morning sun paint the bay gold. He wore his dress uniform with every medal he'd earned, though he'd be taking it off for the last time today. The Navy had offered him a position as a flight instructor, a historical appointment that would have guaranteed his place in the books. He'd turned it down. Instead, he was heading to a small flight school in Illinois, one of the first integrated aviation schools in the country, where he'd teach a new generation of pilots, black, white, and everything in between, how to fly. Serena stood beside him in a simple blue dress, her naval service behind her as well. She'd be running the medical clinic in the same town, close enough to see each other without the weight of military regulations. They'd face challenges. They both knew that. There were still places they couldn't go together. Restaurants that wouldn't serve them. Hotels that would turn them away. But they'd faced worse odds, and won. As they walked toward the taxi that would take them to the train station, Elias felt the weight of his mother's compass in his pocket. Serena had given it back to him, said he should keep it to remember that he'd always found his way home. A group of naval aviators passed them, young pilots fresh from flight school, their wings still shiny and new. One of them, a young black man who couldn't have been more than 20, stopped dead when he recognized Elias. His salute was sharp enough to cut glass, his eyes bright with something that looked like hope. Elias returned the salute, then did something he'd never done before in uniform. He smiled, really smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern face. The young pilot grinned back before hurrying to catch up with his squadron. But Elias could see him walking taller, shoulders squared with new confidence. "You know what you did, don't you?" Serena asked as they climbed into the taxi. "Not just in the war, but after. You changed what's possible." Elias thought about all the flights he'd made, all the battles he'd fought, all the times he'd been told he didn't belong in the sky. He thought about Archie, who'd become, if not a friend then, at least an ally, who wrote him letters now about the new integrated squadron he was leading. He thought about his mother, who'd lived to see her son become something the world said he could never be. He thought about the young pilot who'd just saluted him, who would fly without having to prove he deserved to be there quite as hard as Elias had. "I didn't change what's possible," he said finally, taking Serena's hand as the taxi pulled away from the curb. "I just proved it was always possible. We were just waiting for someone to show them how to see it." The taxi drove through the morning streets of San Francisco, past neighborhoods rebuilding after the war, past factories converting back to peacetime production, past a country trying to figure out what it wanted to become, now that the fighting was over. In the distance, a squadron of planes flew in perfect formation, their contrails painting white lines across the blue sky like promises written in smoke. Elias watched them until they disappeared into the sun, his hand still holding Serena's, the compass in his pocket pointing toward a future that had once seemed impossible, but now spread before them as infinite and open as the sky itself. Years later, when historians wrote about the integration of military aviation, they'd focus on the policies and the protests, the legislation and the lawsuits. But for those who were there, who saw it happen, the story was simpler and more complex simultaneously. It was the story of a man who refused to accept that the color of his skin determined the height of his dreams. It was the story of unlikely allies and unexpected love, of courage that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with showing up day after day in places where you weren't wanted until they couldn't imagine the sky without you. Elias Carter flew his last flight in 1987, taking up a restored Corsair at an air show commemorating the veterans of the Pacific War. By then, his hair had gone gray and his hands weren't quite as steady. But when he climbed into that cockpit, he was 23 again, proving to the world that impossible was just a word people used when they were afraid to try. Serena watched from the ground, their children and grandchildren beside her, as he traced loops and rolls across the sky, the setting sun turning the plane to gold. When he landed and climbed down from the cockpit for the final time, a crowd of young pilots surrounded him, men and women of every color and creed, all wearing the wings he'd helped make possible. They didn't ask for autographs or photos. Instead, one by one, they simply said thank you. And in those two words carried the weight of every barrier broken, every ceiling shattered, every dream that took flight because one man had refused to stay grounded. That night, as they sat on their porch watching the stars come out, Serena asked him if he had any regrets. Elias was quiet for a long moment, thinking about all the fights he'd fought, all the prices paid for progress. Then he pulled out the old compass, its brass worn smooth by decades of handling, the needle still pointing true. "No regrets," he said finally. "Every scar, every slight, every battle, they were all worth it to prove that the sky belongs to anyone brave enough to claim it. Besides," he added, pulling her close as a shooting star streaked across the darkness, "I found my way home. That's all any pilot really wants in the end." The compass sat between them, its needle steady and sure, pointing not toward magnetic north but toward something more profound. The true direction of a life lived in defiance of limitations, a love that transcended convention, and a legacy written not in history books but in the vapor trails of every pilot who flew free because Elias Carter had shown them the way.